Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Gabriel Jaja, producer. Online trolls and fascist chat groups, controversies over campus lectures, cancel culture versus censorship. The daily hazards and debates surrounding free speech dominate headlines and fuel social media storms. In an era where one tweet can launch or end your career, and where free speech is often invoked as a principle but rarely understood, learning to maneuver the fast-changing, treacherous landscape of public discourse has never been more urgent. Suzanne Nossel, CEO of PEN America, sits down with Eric Kohn, Acton's Director of Communications, to discuss her new book, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. You can find additional resources in the show notes of this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. If you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen.
Suzanne Nossel currently serves as the Chief Executive Officer of PEN America, the leading human rights and free expression organization, and she is author of Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. She's a leading voice on free expression issues in the United States and globally, writing and being interviewed frequently for national and international media outlets. Her prior career spanned government service and leadership roles in the corporate and nonprofit sectors, including as COO of Human Rights Watch and Executive Director of Amnesty International. Suzanne Nossel, welcome to Acton Line.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
So for people in our audience who aren't familiar with PEN America, can we start, just tell us a little bit about PEN America's mission?
Sure. We have a mission to both celebrate and defend freedom of expression worldwide. So when it comes to celebrate, that involves the elevation and amplification of literature. So we give out this country's most comprehensive program of literary awards. We do literary festivals and public programs. We have a series of programs that are aimed at enabling writing careers for people who would traditionally be locked out of the book and publishing world. So an Emerging Voices Fellowship, a writing workshop for young undocumented immigrants. And we do all sorts of literary and book events in New York, our headquarters, in Los Angeles and DC, where we have offices, and also through 7 chapter organizations in cities across the country, Miami, Tulsa, Birmingham, Detroit, and elsewhere. And all of that is not just for its own sake, but really in service of our mission to defend freedom of expression worldwide. And I'd say the heart and soul of that historically has been work on behalf of individual writers who pay the highest price for exercising their liberties and find themselves prosecuted, jailed, sometimes tortured, or even killed for the crime of voicing their opinions and ideas, telling their stories. So we advocate on their behalf and try to secure their safety and freedom. We get involved in bringing individuals to safety, protecting them in places where they go to hide and find safe harbor. But we also take on a whole range of free expression policy issues, both here in the United States and around the world, including censorship, disinformation, online harassment, and the threat that that poses to open discourse on social media, press freedom, and a range of other issues. And you can check it all out on our website at PEN, like the old-fashioned thing you write with using ink, .org.
As you look around the world, you mentioned protecting writers who are persecuted for their freedom of expression. As you look around the world, are things getting better? Are they getting worse? Is it kind of largely staying the same? And why do you think that?
They're getting worse, and it's a kind of a couple of converging trends. One is just the trend toward rising authoritarianism globally, with China setting the standard and modeling how a repressive regime can achieve sustained economic growth. That has provided a paradigm that other governments around the world are increasingly looking toward and intrigued by the level of social control that they achieve. So it's become a kind of alternative model to the Western democracy and some of the flaws of Western democracies: income inequality, social unrest, rise of populism, have sort of diminished that model in comparison with the alternative, the authoritarian alternative. And so, we see consistent annual downward trends in, for example, indices that measure freedoms worldwide. So that's one piece of it. A second is the rise of new kinds of technologies and methods of censorship and surveillance. The mass censorship of social media that China has achieved, something that Bill Clinton joked years ago, trying to censor the internet would be like trying to nail Jello to a wall. Well, they've pretty much done it. They have very comprehensive systems that shut down and disincentivize discourse on a widening array of topics in China. And that has become a model. We actually did a report we released just last week on the rise of this notion of sort of digital sovereignty, where every government is trying to dictate the parameters of the internet within their own society, really undercutting the notion of the World Wide Web as this global interchange and exchange of ideas. So these new methods are also new methods of surveillance involving facial recognition, artificial intelligence. So it's getting easier in some ways. They're new, very potent enablers of government repression of freedom of expression that we see on the rise worldwide. We've also seen an abdication of leadership on the flip side of human rights leadership coming from the United States and the West in recent years that has sort of fueled and enabled some of these negative trends. And just the last thing I would say is that authoritarian governments are increasingly reaching across their borders to target and menace even dissidents who have sought refuge in exile. So we're seeing, the Roman Protasevich, the Belarusian journalist who was on a flight from Turkey to Lithuania, and his plane was essentially hijacked by the government of Belarus and forced to land, and he and his girlfriend were put under arrest. That's part of a wider trend of governments not letting go of dissidents who managed to escape their borders and, tracking them down, tracing them down wherever they are.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention we're recording this conversation on Wednesday, June 23rd, and the Hong Kong publication Apple Daily announced today that tomorrow's Thursday edition of their paper will be the final edition of their paper. They are shutting down. Of course, that is an organization founded by Jimmy Lai, who friends of the Acton Institute will be familiar with Jimmy Lai's story. What strikes me, something you said in there, is kind of a lack of moral clarity about these things from the West, of being able to speak about what are clearly human rights abuses, what are problems with the stifling of free expression. Why do you think we're lacking that sense of moral clarity? Because it strikes me that what's going on in Hong Kong in particular would be the kind of thing that, I don't want to say maybe 30 years ago, would have just been an absolutely enormous story that would have really weighed on people in the United States and in the West. And it does, to me, doesn't seem to get the attention that it deserves for what is happening to the people of Hong Kong.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, we have worked on Hong Kong for some years. We did an initial report back in 2015 called Threatened Harbor, about, really just exactly this, the rising encroachments on press freedom in Hong Kong, and sort of sounding the alarm bell that this was a set of worsening trends, and that this historically very freewheeling place and kind of window into China and, hub for news coverage throughout Asia was coming under grave threat. And, since then, everything we predicted has come to fruition. And it's incredibly poignant because, unlike sort of within the mainland or in a place like Iran, in Hong Kong, people are accustomed to living in what felt a lot like a democracy, having freewheeling media, independent media, respected universities with guardrails for academic freedom, a very robust legislature that would have, real political debates, actual elections with at least some degree of choice. And all of that is fast disappearing. And I think a couple reasons. I mean, to your point about why isn't this eliciting more outcry? I think there is just this sense of China, Beijing government being the immovable object. And, the fact that they are the ones imposing this crackdown through their national security law and the knowledge that, really no amount of international outcry is going to cause them to bend. And even the Hong Kong democracy movement, the umbrella movement, which was, incredibly powerful and disciplined and inspirational, the visuals of people camping out in the streets for months, demanding their freedom were, captivated the world. And, the fact that Beijing managed to withstand that and, has in fact now really made that type of organizing impossible, I think has sort of led to Hong Kong's internal democracy movement really being in a state of crisis, and the rest of the world, throwing up their hands with a sense of futility. Now, I think it's incredibly important to continue to draw attention to this, to speak out against it. China hates that. They view everything that happens in Hong Kong as a domestic matter. That's nobody else's business. But that's not what they agreed to when they took over Hong Kong from United Kingdom. And, I also asked the question about the business sector, which remains heavily invested in Hong Kong. Some international and American banks are apparently increasing their personnel based in Hong Kong. And, I think it's time for them to take a hard look about whether they really want to sustain hubs for their Asia-related activities in a place where the free flow of information is going to be sharply constricted, where employees are not going to be free to speak their minds. Hong Kong is becoming a very different environment. I think the business community needs to wake up to that, and it has been hesitant to do so.
As you say that, I think one of the key differences, we hear a lot of conversation now comparing America's relationship or lack of a relationship with China to a new Cold War. And I think the big difference there, as you mentioned, the business community, the idea of a lot of businesses doing anywhere near the amount of business that they do with China, with the Soviet Union, would have been unthinkable. Why do you think the business community, especially, is it just the money opportunity, views China so differently, if we're to believe, and I don't know that I accept the notion that this is a new Cold War. I think there are some marked differences. But there clearly is, something between the United States and China. And as you mentioned, the business community seems to be all right with being involved in a country that is doing the things they're doing, not only to the people of Hong Kong, but to their own citizens. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, I think it's the money. China, is fast becoming, what will be overtake the U.S. and become the world's largest economy. It's an enormous consumer market. It's important for just about every industry. And so I think there has been a strong incentive to downplay, make excuses for and kind of sidestep the moral compromises that are entailed with doing business in China. I mean, not completely. We don't see the major US social media companies and internet companies, Google, Facebook and Twitter are not in China because they've concluded it's not possible to run their services in a way that's consistent with their kind of articulated ostensible values and the strictures of Chinese censorship. But that, they still do. Facebook is thought to earn as much as $1 billion a year in ad revenue from Chinese companies. So there are still, Google has reportedly been circling around trying to figure out if they can find another way into China. So it's not as if China doesn't have an influence on them nonetheless, even though they're not in the market. And then for other industries, we did a whole report at PEN America called Made in Hollywood, Censored in Beijing, that is about the rising influence of Chinese censorship on the movie industry. And as the Chinese film-going market has become the world's, by some measures, the world's largest, particularly for certain categories of films that do really well there, action films, adventure films. Hollywood studios have made changes to plots. They've kind of glorified and reified Chinese characters. They've avoided any talk of Tibet and Xinjiang. Disney from Mulan had a kind of crediting of Xinjiang authorities in the closing credits of the film. So and if you talk to people in Hollywood about this, as we have, they have kind of constructed a worldview that makes it acceptable. Part of it is the idea that, well, they're not trying to appease Chinese censors, but rather trying to please Chinese consumers. So if Chinese consumers have these sensitivities, they really ought to be respected because this is just a matter of satisfying your customer. Or the idea that, these changes are really modest and, it's better to get the film into the market, even if you have to make some compromises. So they sort of have ways of thinking about it that, I'd say downplay some of the serious moral dilemmas that are at stake here.
China, when it comes to limitations on free expression, is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Where else around the world are there real meaningful threats to free expression that we're really not paying attention to, at least not in the way that we can come up with ready examples of what's happening in China?
Yeah, I mean, many places there are new laws that constrict the internet, that insist, for example, that internet companies house both data and personnel in country, and they're called data localization laws. And what that means is that, if Twitter or Facebook is operational, which they are in these places like Pakistan or Brazil, if there is a post that the government objects to and, say it's anonymous and they want to find out who's behind that account, if the data is localized, they can, reach across, and no matter what privacy protections you may think you have in an end user agreement with a social media platform, those can be pierced and penetrated, and you can be exposed. And that's become kind of a tactic of choice. We also see draconian tactics, like in Nigeria, shutting down Twitter entirely after the platform is used to insult the ruling government. In India, a democracy, ostensibly, there is a long-running campaign to pressure social media companies to remove content that they say infringes on local law. So it's kind of, a whack-a-mole popping up everywhere, a recognition that social media can be used to rally opposition, to foment dissent, to incubate new ideas that may pose a challenge to a ruling government, and a effort to clamp down.
I mentioned in the intro the book that was published in July of 2020, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. Suzanne, I've done enough of these interviews that I found that the question that authors seems to have asked of them, what is your book about?
Sure. The book is an effort to explain how we can all live together in our diverse, polarized, digitized, and fractured society without curbing free speech protections. We've seen a lot of calls for different forms of censoriousness here in this country, curbs on speech to protect the vulnerable, to avoid the spread of dangerous ideas, to prevent harassment. And, those impulses are understandable. And I think, it's worth recognizing where they come from. And often I would say the impulse is one that is protective, humane, empathic, but they can result in, if we're not careful, in a climate of real censoriousness and chilling of speech in our society. And so what I offer in the book are 20 principles for how I think we can square the circle and drive forward a more equal and inclusive society, but one that sustains robust protections for free speech and a freewheeling marketplace of ideas. So I have 5 principles that are directed toward speakers, individuals when you're in the process of expressing your views, 5 directed toward listeners, 5 directed toward people when debating free speech issues, and 5 to consider when contemplating free speech policy questions. And so it's really meant as kind of a manual for how we can reboot and update free speech so that it can survive into the next century. One of my impetuses for writing the book was a recognition that, particularly among a rising generation of young people, sort of who lean left and are deeply interested in social justice causes, that there is a skepticism and alienation with free speech and the First Amendment that has set in. And free speech has come to be regarded in some quarters as a smokescreen for hatred, as that which protects those who spew bigotry, and as even antagonistic to progress on issues like racial justice and gender justice. And I think that's a very fundamental misapprehension. I think free speech protections are elemental to all social justice struggles. They're really what makes social progress possible, and agitation and dissent. Historically, it's been the dissidents and those who have challenged authority who have relied most heavily on free speech protections to enable them to do what they do. And so my book is really an effort at a corrective and to introduce to that rising generation how it is that free speech can and is necessary to support the causes that they care about.
Hey, this is Eric, your host, and I just want to cut in here to tell you that today is your lucky day because we have a limited number of copies of Suzanne's book, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All, that we're giving away to the first 10 people who email us at actonline@acton.org. That's actonline@acton.org. The book and shipping are all free. All you have to do is be one of the first 10 people to email us at actonline@acton.org right now to get your copy. Now, back to the show. For those rising generations, where do you think the skepticism or even antipathy towards free expression and the First Amendment are coming from?
I think it is derivative of an effort to push forward sort of the next phase of the racial justice and social justice movement. In the 1960s and 70s, we addressed issues like equal pay, equality, and desegregation in schools, and sort of the tangible manifestations of racial and gender injustice in our world. Not that those have been eradicated, but those formal measures, for the most part, have already been taken. And what we grapple with is that, nonetheless, racism and sexism and other forms of bigotry remain pervasive. And I think that has forced us to take it a level deeper and consider the sociological, psychological, dimensions of stereotypes and prejudices that lie very deep within individuals. I think that sort of somewhat unavoidably implicates speech, how people describe one another, to what degree we're respectful of how people want to think of and talk about themselves, whether we're willing to give airspace to ideas that may call into question a sort of orthodoxy about how we ought to be driving forward equality. And so I think that is at the root of a lot of these clashes. And, it's a genuinely thorny issue in that, it's true that stereotypes and slurs historically have played a big role in perpetuating racism and sexism. And so you can't say that language and speech has no influence, that it can never cause harm. I document in the book that there's evidence that particularly if someone is subject to pervasive slurs and stereotyping throughout their lives, that it can cause not just psychological, but physiological harm. It can impair academic performance. So that is true. It's also true that those harms can be assumed, they can be projected onto others, they can be speculated about, and they can be exaggerated. And I think that kind of language and discourse of harm has, in some ways been weaponized to try to shut down speech that people just disagree with.
How do you effectively combat that? So the more extreme version of that argument would be arguments that essentially equate speech and violence. And you hear lesser versions of that where you had with the op-ed that Tom Cotton, senator from Arkansas, had published in the New York Times, that it made the workplace unsafe for the people who worked there. Or another example, from the writer Kevin Williamson from National Review, for the short time he was at The Atlantic, the members of The Atlantic saying that his presence in the workplace would make them feel threatened, even though he was to be working remotely from Dallas, Texas, and not in an actual office. How can we effectively push back on the idea? Well, I assume by in part recognizing that, some of the things you pointed out about speech is that, speech, you can say awful things and it can be harmful, but that, as I think we would agree, it's important that people be able to express themselves. How do we effectively handle those situations?
Yeah, look, it's difficult. And I think ultimately there needs to be kind of a long-term recalibration of the place of free speech in our society and in the education of our children. We've started to do here at PEN America Free Speech Institutes for young people, where we're really explaining to them kind of the grounding underpinnings of free speech, what it is like to live in a society where free speech isn't protected, how to think about and debate some of these dilemmas, what the risks are if you afford to authorities, be that the government or a university administration or the principal of a school, the right to aggressively police speech. It may seem like a good idea in a given instance if they're going to be punishing somebody who is acting like a bully, but that power can also be turned around and used to suppress speech with which you might agree. And what we find is when it's explained to young people, they really can understand it, and they become enthusiastic. And I think there is a real power in the idea of free speech. It's something that has always held an intrinsic appeal to Americans and to people around the world. And I think it's critically important to try to rekindle that recognition of just the potency and the expansiveness of free speech and what it makes possible within our society. I also think it's incredibly important for people, and particularly people in positions of authority, to be willing to step up and defend even controversial speech, and not just to capitulate to the loudest voices that clamor to shut it down.
as we look back historically, you think through American political history how often the left would be associated with the idea that they would defend that most controversial of speech, the kind of thing that would be despised. And there seems to be a shift, and we have many interesting coalitional and realignments going on in the political world. Where do you think that shift happened with regard to that willingness that was, I think, inherently American to defend even the most controversial speech as something that should happen, and that the best way to combat that was with more speech?
I think it's happened sort of gradually and then been accelerated in the last few years. I think one of the, unfortunate factors at work is the kind of uncorking of hate speech in our society. We, for a long time, there were powerful taboos that, effectively prohibited hateful speech and slurs sort of in mainstream discourse. And we had political leaders who were willing, for example, to call out somebody, a pastor in Florida who threatened to burn a Quran, to say, okay, he has the First Amendment right to do this, but we condemn it because it's clearly intended to threaten and intimidate Americans of Muslim descent. And when you had people like the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense coming out and saying that, I think then a community, in that case, the Muslim community, feels supported. They feel like, all right, even though there's this hateful gesture going on, this does not represent mainstream opinion. People in positions of power are standing by our side. What we then had over 4 years during the Trump administration was a kind of enabling environment for hateful speech coming from the highest levels of the White House. And, whether it was toward undocumented immigrants or Muslims or members of racial minorities, kind of this menacing tone, harsh language, making excuses for overt bigotry and violence. And I think what that led to and helped to accelerate was this sort of backlash of censoriousness on the left, in a sense that, look, if hateful speech is coursing freely throughout society, then, in the environment we're in, whether that's our campus or the pages of our magazine or newspaper, we have got to ward this off. It's got to stop at the doorstep of the institutions that we control. And so I think there's been a real backlash. And I think part of the answer and how we get past that actually is by reestablishing some of these norms and taboos, so that people, don't have this kind of insidious sense that hateful attitudes are, just running freely.
The term we haven't mentioned yet, and that I think in a conversation like this we have to discuss, is cancel culture. To you, what is cancel culture? How did it become how and why did it become a thing? And what, if anything, can be done about it?
Sure. Look, I think the term cancel culture, I'm not a big fan of it. I think it's used very elastically to refer to everything from, on the one side, people who have been convicted of crimes, whose role in cultural life is, kind of red line. So someone like a Harvey Weinstein or a Bill Cosby, where people may not want to watch their shows or see their films because they've become persona non grata due to criminal acts. That's one side of it. And then, on the other end of the spectrum are people who, for a fleeting gesture or a single word, face draconian professional and personal consequences in this, very unforgiving ecosystem where even if you had no racist or sexist or otherwise bigoted intent, if you say the wrong thing, you can be permanently banished and pilloried on social media. And look, I believe that there should be consequences for speech, but I think principles of proportionality need to operate. And, it's an ungoverned space. And so there is no one oftentimes in a position to assert that principle of proportionality. And the nature of social media is such that when someone says, and particularly someone who is prominent or in a position of authority, or who is controversial for some reason, one misstep can lead to a kind of pile-on for all sorts of different motives. And there's very often a failure to interrogate the intent of the statement. What did they actually mean? The context of the statement, where and when and why might they have said this? So much of our speech is spread around online, devoid of any context, devoid of, any personal connection between the speaker and whoever is reading or absorbing the speech, so that it's very difficult to ascertain intent. And there's sort of this impulse to think the worst, and the most incendiary stuff tends to travel the farthest and fastest through the algorithms of social media. And so that contributes to this harsh environment. The aspect of cancel culture that I find most objectionable are these situations where you have a mobilization of the public, or it can be sometimes the staff of an institution urging and demanding a punishment for speech. Because what that does, I sort of touched on this a moment ago, is it arrogates into the hands of those in a position of authority extended power to punish speech. And people want them to punish speech because they're furious and something outrageous was said, but they don't realize that what they're doing is reinforcing the prerogative and discretion of those who are already in positions of power to extend that power even further. And what we see historically is, on balance, when you give authorities the power to police speech, they will use that power in self-serving ways to protect themselves, to suppress dissent, to muzzle narratives that call into question what they're doing and why. And so overall, I really believe we're better off limiting that discretion to police speech. And what worries me about this trend toward cancel culture is that it has a propensity to expand it.
As we're about to come to a close here, let me run this thought by you. I'm curious what you think the extent that technology, especially the kind of internet technology, social media even more so, is still very young. So I'm an older millennial, or as I've learned recently on Twitter, a geriatric millennial, and no one really consulted me on that name, but we'll put that aside for now. What I think sets my micro demographic aside from especially those that are younger than me is that I can still remember growing up without a computer in my home when I was a kid and without having the internet. And what I see, or how I view it, is that you have the way that digital communities are built online. When you're in a real physical community with people in your neighborhood or church or community groups, and if you were to say something untoward, someone would take you aside and say, hey, that's really not cool. You shouldn't say that. And when people speak now online, you get, I think, two different reactions simultaneously. You get one group of people that wants to excommunicate them from polite society forever, and another group of people that doesn't offer any kind of a corrective. They just go, no, you're right, and you should keep going with that. And more reasonable voices kind of get drowned out as these two poles seem to solidify. How much do you think the fact that technology is still relatively new to us and we're learning how to live with it is exacerbating these problems?
I think it does. And, I've also thought a bit about this in the context of the pandemic. I mean, I think there's something quite deep in how we're wired as human beings, that trust is formed through human contact. That's how you bond with your parents as an infant. And in a world where we have so many interactions that are devoid of that human sensory contact, whether it's on social media or on all the Zooms that we've been doing over the last year and a half, I think something is lost. And I think some of the tempering propensities of a personal relationship, the desire to search for common ground, for agreement, there's a very human impulse to achieve a smile in someone else's face. And online, that doesn't really exist. And I think the whole incentive structure and, what triggers our physiological response is different. You want the maximum number of likes and retweets. And often you get that by, not by words of encouragement, but by some pithy, unexpected, off-the-cuff response that has to be delivered, instantaneously, or the moment will have passed. And I document in the book many instances where that can lead people into real hot water and become a flashpoint for controversy. People have spoken too quickly. They've rushed to judgment. They have misspoken in haste. And so I think there is a kind of diminution in our discourse. Of course, there are also many great benefits of social media, and I'm on social media, and there's aspects of it that, I think are incredibly important and actually really foster connection and communication. And so getting that balance right is incredibly difficult. I think we just have to be forthright about both the benefits and the downsides.
These problems can seem huge and daunting. What advice or strategies would you offer to individual people for things that they can do to deal with this kind of culture of censorious speech, whether that be coming from outside forces or from self-censorship? How would you recommend people, in terms of their own communication and speech in their interactions with others, what principles would you give them to operate by?
And that is exactly the focus of Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All, my book. It actually comes out in paperback in the beginning of July. And I really spell out in depth the principles that I think can enable you to be a force for free speech within our society. Part of it is being conscientious in how you speak, taking into account intent and context when you're evaluating the speech of others, being willing to step out and defend even controversial speech, being thoughtful when you have ideas that some people are going to find offensive, finding a way to express them thoughtfully, to anticipate the counter arguments so that you can have a reasoned discourse. So I hope that those 20 principles offer some concrete, actionable guidance. And I think it's a call to action because we need more free speech defenders. This is an elemental freedom that underpins our whole society and democracy. But we one of the premises of the book is that we're sort of accustomed to historically thinking of the free speech as synonymous with the First Amendment. But of course, the kinds of controversies that you and I are talking about today, things like cancel culture, really don't implicate the First Amendment at all. And so the traditional strategy of relying on courts and lawyers to defend free speech for us isn't going to work anymore. It really will hinge on what we do as citizens. And so I hope the book offers a primer and a manifesto to guide how we can become mobilized as a force for free speech within our own society and country.
Suzanne Nossel currently serves as the Chief Executive Officer of PEN America, and she is author of the book Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. Suzanne, thank you so much for joining us today on Acton Line.
Thanks for having me.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at actonline@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Gabriel Jaja.